I want to continue with my series on America's founding and the Christian base and foundation of our country by examining some of the writings, some of the quotes, and some of the inscriptions we see on buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And in this particular video and lesson, what I want to do is talk about the U.S. Constitution. The last video that I did was specific to the state constitutions, and hopefully you've had a chance to see that and review it and saw that in the state constitutions there was a lot of very, very explicit language relative to particularly office holders, that office holders in those colonies had to be professing Christians. Now, what we're going to find in a few minutes as we look at the federal constitution, we see less of that. But we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the reason for that, for why it's not quite as explicit as it was in the state constitution. So let's take a look at the Constitution. I'm not going to really read the Constitution, but we're going to talk about the Constitution, basically. So again, as I said, if you saw the last lesson, last video, you understand that virtually all of the colonies, the state constitutions, as they were drawn up state by state, were explicitly Christian, particularly in relation to describing who could hold an office in the legislature, the governor, et cetera, that they had to be professing Christians. Now, the federal constitution, being created by the states, of course, was not to interfere with the states' rights to govern their own religious affairs. And this is the explanation as to why there is little direct reference to religion in the federal constitutions. The states already had their constitutions in establishing governors and legislatures and so forth. And of course, the intent was for the federal government to assume powers to do things that the individual states could not. So if the individual states had already done something or was capable of doing certain things and governing themselves, the federal government was not necessarily being established to do those things. So what does the absence of these direct references to God and to religion and specifically in this case to Christianity indicate? Is that an indicator that the framers of the Constitution were looking to institute a secular government and create a secular document? Church historian Dr. Philip Schaff indicates that this is no more so than saying the Book of Esther or the Song of Solomon, of course, two books in the Old Testament, were not divine books because the name of God is not mentioned. Clearly, they are both included in the canon, in the books, the accepted books of the Old Testament, and God is in them, although not specifically named. And so what his argument is that God is present in the Constitution with or without a direct reference to his name, so to speak. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, of course, he is referred to very, very specifically, the Creator with a capital C. But in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, we don't see this kind of direct reference. Now, one reason perhaps was that because the state constitutions were so explicit with their references and demands with respect to Christian issues, that the framers of the federal constitution felt there was no need to be as explicit in the federal constitution. So since all the colonies and now states obviously had established their own constitutions, And in them, they were very, very specific relative to the need for particularly office holders to be professing Christians. There would be no need for that to be explicitly stated in so many terms relative to the federal Constitution. So the idea of what they were intent in doing in creating, drafting, um, and eventually ratifying a federal constitution. The idea was to form the best form of civil government at a national level. Again, understanding the system that they had come from, the monarchy with the parliament and so forth. There are references in the Constitution which do sort of Christianize it to a degree. One thing is that it exempted Sunday as a day within which the president may veto legislation. He could not do so on Sunday. Now, why is that important? Well, only Christianity recognizes Sunday as a holy day. And so obviously that's kind of making deference, offering deference to Christianity. The other thing is that noticing that the drafting took place, it's described, the year it was described as, and you could put this in quotes, in the year of our Lord, 1787. So, of course, we would say 1787, but it's described as in the year of our Lord. They specifically put that in there. And of course, with a capital L, that would be specifically making reference to Jesus Christ. Now, the fact is that there were different denominations reflected in the states. Each of the different states, having become states from the colonies, tended to have a populace that was predominantly one particular Christian denomination versus another. There were predominantly Congregationalists in one state. There were more Episcopalians in another, Dutch Reformed in another, Presbyterians, Quakers, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, and Methodists as well. And so the different states tended to have more of one or the other. And so, according to James Madison, there was discord of religious opinions amongst the participants in the Constitutional Convention. And so, as a result of the fact that they were all coming from different Christian denominations, they tried to avoid discussions of theology and therefore including that, in the federal Constitution. They kind of set that aside, understanding that these different Christian denominations were favored in one state versus another. Another line of thought is that the framers, when they were at the convention and they were drafting and crafting this Constitution, again, they wanted to assure that the federal government did not usurp state authority in the area of religion. Again, understanding that they had come from the British monarchy. They were, many of them at least, and not just England actually had a state church. And so they obviously came to the Americas in order to escape that. So the last thing they would have wanted to do would be to put in this new American Constitution, this new Constitution of the United States, any kind of reference to a particular denomination and to, kind of stamp it as the national or the federal church. So the federal government was prohibited from establishing a religious test. But as we've seen, the states did not have any kind of prohibition against that. And so what this did, since the federal government didn't do that, it freed the states from any kind of ecclesiastical domination at the federal level. So the federal government was not going to establish any kind of particular religious faith. And they were thinking predominantly relative to a denomination. So the First Amendment says that Congress, specifically it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay, again, this is speaking directly about the idea of establishing a national church. And so, again, it's very interesting and important that we see that it is intended, this First Amendment is intended to apply to the federal government only. And specifically, it says Congress. So the First Amendment to the Constitution, as far as the establishment of religion, is speaking of Congress, the federal government, the Congress of the United States. It doesn't prohibit any of the states from doing it. It only applies to the Congress of the United States. So again, it doesn't forbid the states from doing so, and leaves matters of religion to the states to go ahead and work out on their own, which they did. It was designed to prohibit the establishment of a national church, which of course was an experience that they had and had fled from a century before, more before. Here's a quote from a Supreme Court judge, name of Joseph Story. The general, if not universal, sentiment in America was, of course, this is back when the Constitutional Convention was being drafted, that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far as such encouragement was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. So as we saw when we were looking at the state constitutions, they established a freedom of religion for the populace, while at the same time establishing that office holders had to be professing Christians. So again, they were not establishing state constitutions that permitted the persecution of people who didn't hold one faith system or another. But office holders, they obviously had a religious test in those state constitutions. So anyway, that was what was allowed in the states, but was being prohibited at the national level. Judge Story goes on to say, an attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation, if not universal indignation. So there was no thought of establishing a secular government, only one that showed no particular preference to a single denomination or church. That is what they were trying to avoid, the establishment of a national church, even if it was a Protestant one that they might generally agree with. At this point in our early history, when the Constitution was being crafted and drafted and so forth, there was a general acceptance of the people's reliance on the Christian faith. The framers were certainly aware of it. They were accepting of it and shared it. We talked last week in a previous lesson, I should say, that while there are some who claim that the signers of the Declaration and many of our early founding fathers were deists, there is actually very little evidence to support that. They were overwhelmingly professing evangelical Christians, and so they shared this Christian faith and this Christian experience. And that's one of the reasons why there would have been no need to explicitly make references to Christianity, because it was so well accepted at that point in time that the founders were Christians, that the vast majority of the people were Christians, and so many of the other documents were Christian in nature, particularly as we looked at all the different state constitutions. There's a comparison that the Bible in the beginning of Genesis, the very first phrases or verses, the Bible doesn't begin with an argument for the existence of God. It says, in the beginning, God created. It doesn't make an argument for the existence of God. It simply states that he's the creator. Well, in the same manner, since everything else that had been drafted and crafted and accepted, the Declaration of Independence, the state constitutions of all the different states at that point in time, there didn't seem to be a need to explicitly lay out that Christianity was to be the foundation, because it was in many respects already assumed and accepted. Quote from Robert Baird: "Had the excellent men who framed the Constitution foreseen the inferences that have been drawn from the omission of being explicit relative to Christianity and Christian faith, they would have recognized in a proper formula the existence of God and the truth and the importance of the Christian religion." So there were already, within, well, this quote, of course, in 1844, so a little over 50 years after the ratification of the Constitution, I guess there were already some questions being raised as to whether in fact the founders had sought to create a secular government, or one that was kind of free from religious expression at all. But the bottom line is that Christianity was such a prevalent cornerstone in America at that point in our history that it was unnecessary to explicitly state this to be so in the Constitution. The prevailing Protestant view at the time was the government of these United States was necessarily, rightfully, and lawfully Christian because of obviously the overwhelming number of the founders who were professing Christians, the presence of the explicit Christianity in the state constitutions and so forth. And the bottom line is, the actuality is that it wasn't very popular in the United States, this new nation at that point in time, to be an unbeliever, or what one might call an infidel at that point in time. So were the framers to see what has transpired, and certainly if in 1844 there were those who were questioning whether in fact that America was, quote, a Christian nation or not, they would be quite surprised to see what's going on today. So if they had been aware, obviously, back in the 1780s when they were creating this federal constitution, that there would be people questioning this, I think it's fair to say that they would have been more careful to be explicit about the foundation of our culture, society, and constitution is Christianity. It is clear that Christianity served as the foundation for the country, and I think that there are a couple different things that make that absolutely evident. First of all, the writings of the founders themselves. Secondly, the state constitutions that we looked at. And in a future lesson, we're going to look at at what education in America looked like. As late as 1982, Congress stated about the Bible: biblical teachings inspired concepts of civil government that are contained in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So even up until the 1980s, approximately 200 years after its ratification, that it was being recognized indeed that Christianity was the foundation of the government that was formed back by our founders in the 1700s. From their writings, it is clear that the founders believed this governmental system could only work for a society and culture which manifested the internal restraints and controls evident from using the Word of God as their standard. John Adams wrote very succinctly, our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, obviously, those who are predominantly Christian have the self-control and the self-restraint that they don't need the external control and clamping down so much of a government entity, so to speak. They will behave themselves. They will be moral and ethical. Um, so that so that again that you don't need the strong arm of the government to come down on them. Now, the more that we as a culture and a society and as a country drift away from those religious underpinnings, obviously the more we need government clamping down with rules, laws, and regulations to maintain order. If the populace is not going to maintain order on its own by being self-controlled, then the government's going to have to do it. And unfortunately, this is what we see more and more of, the more we drift away from those religious Christian underpinnings that our country was founded on. So again, the more we move away from the foundation of faith that our nation was established on, the more we do that, we do so at our own peril as a nation, as a culture, as a society. So I hope this has been informative. Um, hope this has kind of given you a better understanding of why perhaps the federal Constitution was not quite as open and explicit about Christianity being the foundation for the document itself, given that the Declaration of Independence was more explicit, and certainly, as you understand now, hopefully, all of the states were very, very explicit in terms of Christianity being not only favored and preferred, but required, particularly for office holders. Certainly, there was freedom of religion, freedom to practice any religion or no religion amongst the populace of the states, but office holders had to be professing Christians. And so we're going to move on and we're going to look at education in America at that point in time, which I think will provide some great insights. We'll also look specifically at some of the founding fathers. As I said, overwhelmingly they were Christians, not deists. So hopefully, again, this has been helpful to you, and I hope you'll look for the next lesson. God bless you.